When working on the command line, you will encounter two types of paths to files and directories: absolute and relative paths. It is important to understand the differences between the two and when to use one over the other. Before we discuss absolute and relative paths, we need to define what we mean by a path. A path identifies the location of a file or directory. You can think of it as the path through the file system to the resource. The difference between absolute and relative paths is the starting location of the path. Let's look at the notes.txt file shown here in the file browser. We can trace the path from the root of the file system through the directories home, bob, and files to get to the notes.txt file. This is an example of an absolute path. Absolute paths always start from the root of the file system and ignore your current working directory. On the command line, the absolute path for the notes.txt file looks like this. Notice that if I change my current working directory, the absolute path still works. If the path were incorrect, we would see an error. In contrast to an absolute path, a relative path is the path from the current working directory to the resource. Since it starts from the current working directory, the relative path can be different depending on your current working directory. Let's go back to our home directory so we can see some examples. If we are in Bob's home directory, all we need for the relative path to the notes.txt file is the subdirectory files. If we look at it in the file manager, we are already here in Bob's home directory. All we have to do is go into the files directory to get notes.txt. On the command line, the path looks like this. Sometimes you will also see a relative path like this start with a dot slash. In this case, the paths are equivalent. The second version is just intentionally specifying that we are starting in the current working directory, which is indicated by the period. If we change our directory to be the files directory, we don't need to provide any directory information to see the file. However, we can still use the dot slash prefix to specify that we want to use the one in the current directory. This may seem unnecessary at the moment, but when we talk about path environment variables later in the course, the benefit of this method will be apparent. If we change directories to the backup directory, the relative path must include information to go back up one directory to Bob's home directory and then go into the files directory. Remember that the dot dot is shorthand for the current working directory's parent directory. As a final example, we will change our directory to somewhere else on the file system. Since our current working directory is in a completely different subdirectory off of the root directory, the path needs to go all the way back to the root directory before we can get to the file. In this case, the relative path is longer than the absolute path. This isn't usually the case, but it does happen. This brings us to the topic of knowing when to use an absolute path versus a relative path. First, if you need a path that is valid from anywhere on the file system, use an absolute path. Note that using an absolute path assumes a global directory structure. If you're only going to be using the path on the same system or same type of operating system, then this shouldn't be a problem. Since absolute paths contain the entire path from the file system root, they are frequently longer than relative paths. One common way to make absolute paths easier to build is to use an environment variable that contains a base directory upon which paths can be built. As compared to absolute paths, relative paths are generally shorter and easier to use. Note that using a relative path assumes the same local directory structure. If you are only using the path in a similar environment, like your own home directory, then this shouldn't be a problem. Since it is easier to ensure that the local directory structure is similar on different systems, relative paths are usually more portable across systems. As a result, relative paths are preferred for general usage. This means that if you don't have a specific need for an absolute path, use a relative path.